My name is Marek Matraszek. I'm the chairman of CEE Government Relations. We're a major public affairs and communications consultancy operating throughout the region. You know, Central and Eastern Europe, a catch-all phrase. And I think this is one of the things that is becoming increasingly evident, that what even 10, 15, but certainly 20 years ago looked like a fairly homogenous part of Europe is really disassembling. And that's one of the reasons why it's very difficult to talk about the generalities in Central Europe. You really have to go country to country to get an idea of the shifts and the changes that are going to be affecting them over the next few years. You know, initially, as I said, back in the early 90s, everything seemed very uniform and homogenous. These countries had joint goals, primarily EU membership, NATO membership. They had common challenges coming out of the communist period and the Soviet occupation, big policy issues, privatization, marketization, opening up to foreign trade. All these issues brought these countries together. And to be fair, right until the middle of the 2000s, 2004, when the first first accession to the EU happened for Poland, Czech, and Slovakia and Hungary, it was very easy to talk about what brings the countries together. Now that's much more difficult, because once the big issues have been put to bed, the particular interests of the countries starting to diverge. And if you look at the big issues, then obviously energy and Russia is one of them. It's fair to say that primarily Hungary is the outlier here, has had less issue in keeping a close relationship with Russia. But for Poland especially, the issue of energy diversification has put it in the front line of debate within the region and in relation to the European Union on issues such as Nord Stream 2, the need to diversify primarily away from Russian gas monopolies through Russian gas supplies. And to a lesser or greater extent, that's been a feature of distinction between Poland on the one hand, Hungary on the other, and some of the countries somewhere in the middle. The other issue which is really out there increasingly is the degree of integration with the Eurozone. And we've seen this, and I'll come back to the EU a bit later on, but certainly one of the major vectors of disassembling, if you like, is the fact that several countries, Poland among them, Poland, Hungary and others, are not members of the Euro. And as we see within the European Union, increasing debate, particularly from President Macron, wanting to see a greater degree of Euro integration. And that may be a further factor which will cause some rupture within Central Europe. The other thing which is happening domestically, of course, is that these countries, well, they've never really been that stable politically, and I'm sure those of you who've been investing in Central Europe over the last decade or so are, pretty familiar with the chopping and changing of governments, elections, parties. But this is happening more and more, and I think in Poland in particular, this is an interesting factor for those of you who are here. Over the last 5 years, we've had the Law and Justice government seemingly very heavily entrenched. But the recent domestic challenges that have been faced by Prime Minister Morawiecki over the COVID crisis, over EU issues, over the abortion debate, has led to a fairly dramatic drop in the opinion poll ratings of the ruling Law and Justice Party. There's another poll that came out this morning, I believe, that shows them now almost neck and neck with the civic platform opposition. That may presage a change of government at some point in Poland. And this is, again, a factor that you're seeing more and more in Central Europe. You're getting more division within each country. In Hungary, you have an opposition which is gaining strength. In Slovakia, you have a disconnect between the centre-right government and the more liberal president, Mrs. Czaputova. So more internal political instability as well. So less unity externally and less unity internally. So a much more volatile region politically. Apart from the internal dynamics, of course, you have three major external vectors, if you like, of relationships, three major sources of strategic influence that are vying for the attentions of Central Europe. Now, the last few years, particularly under President Trump, have been very good for the United States in Central Europe. President Trump, one of the things that was clear was his very strong support for the 3Cs initiative. I'll come back to that in a minute. And whatever criticism one can make of his views on Russia, one thing which was very strong under Trump was an increasing presence of NATO, particularly US forces in Central Europe, and we've had defense cooperation agreements signed between Hungary and the United States, Poland and the United States, and a significant shift of US military presence into the region through a rotational presence and also increased semi-permanent basing. So a very strong a push by the United States for influence within Central Europe over the last couple of years.
So
and we've also had, obviously, the
what number are you dialing on?
The election of President Biden, President-elect Biden. A lot of people have been asking, well, how will that impact the presence of the United States in Central Europe? Yes, there may be a shift of emphasis by Biden towards the European Union, particularly Brussels, and rebuilding relationships between Germany and France. But there's still a lot that brings together the Biden administration with the region. There's an increasingly commonality of the perception of Russia. We've had some very encouraging statements by some putative Biden officials talking about the need to maintain the dynamic of defense spending in the region. And a number of the people that are coming into the Biden administration are very strong on the need for energy diversification, particularly support for Poland's opposition to Nord Stream. And the other interesting factor, some of the advisors of Biden have taken a very robust position on the need to to engage more heavily in the democratization of Belarus and encourage an opening to the Ukraine. And these are all issues where the bulk of the Central European countries are aligned. So although there will be a shift, I think, of attention on the one hand back to Brussels, Berlin, Paris, the focus on Central Europe will not go away because there is too many commonalities in terms of the strategic interests. And this sort of relationship, I think, is very similar in relation to the EU. Yes, you do have, of course, the current crisis that we've seen emerging as a result of the decision by Poland and Hungary to threaten a veto of the next EU budget of the COVID recovery plan if the EU does not loosen up on the link that is trying to be made between the Parliament and the Commission on linking the transfer of these payments to what the EU calls breaches of rule of law. A huge issue in Poland and Hungary, very sensitive, too detailed to go into at the moment. There's a lot of prospect that this spat will be resolved, possibly at the next head of government summit in Brussels in around about the 10th to 11th of December, I believe. But nonetheless, what this does show is there is an increasing divergence, certainly between Poland and Hungary, and how they perceive their cultural autonomy, their judicial autonomy in relation to Europe. And that is not going to go away despite whatever compromise is reached. But at the end of the day, the next few years, I think, are going to be strong for the Central Europe in relation to Brussels. Putting aside Poland and Hungary for a while, the dynamics, I think, of the EU after Brexit are going to shift within the EU considerably. And whereas in the past it was the UK that was predominantly pushing for a much more flexible Europe, a much Europe which was going to hold on to its competitive agenda, I think this dynamic, will be taken up by many EU countries who, like the UK, also have an interest in maintaining a competitive environment within Europe, who want to maintain a strong relationship with the US. I think we'll have a very strong voice on the upcoming EU-US free trade negotiations. And there's a lot of financial and economic interdependence as well. Remember that Germany exports more to the Visegrad countries and to France, China, the US. There's a lot of supply chains interlinked, particularly with Germany. And that's a very strong factor in explaining why Germany is trying to broker, as it were, a compromise between Hungary, especially, and the EU because of their very strong economic investments in Hungary. There are too many linkages, too many interdependencies, too many supply chains going on in order for the EU to risk any sort of permanent rupture. So there's that dynamic. Finally, the final vector that's coming in and obviously trying to influence Central Europe is both Russia and China. Remember, a few years ago, China was seen by many Central European countries as a real possible strategic partner. There was the famous 16+1 initiative. There were all sorts of efforts made to bring Chinese infrastructure investment into the region. That's really gone away, largely as a result of the recognition that China is becoming an increasingly strategic competitor to not just to Europe, but obviously to the whole Western alliance. We've seen the issues involving cyber and so on, and the very robust position of the Trump administration in relation to China, Chinese technology, Huawei. You saw most Central European countries cleaving to the US position, and Russia, say no more. The activities of Russia in Ukraine and in Belarus have really strengthened, if anything, the Central European determination to keep Russian strategic influence at bay. That goes back to the issues I was describing earlier of cyber threats, energy threats, propaganda threats. Central Europe is pretty much immune to the Russia virus, if you like to put it that way. There are one or two outliers, of course. I've mentioned Hungary. There's President Zeman in the Czech Republic. There's Serbia, who are, all these actors are trying to find ways of working with Russia and China. But broadly, Central Europe remains fairly immune to that threat. Now, just moving on a little bit towards the conclusion, obviously, just to show where we are on COVID, that's on everybody's minds, of course. Well, Central Europe has not done well in this second wave. I'm sure you're looking at these charts as everybody else is in Europe. And what we've had in Central Europe over the last couple of months, in deep contrast to what you had here in the early spring in the first wave, is a very, very increased levels of contagion. And it's pretty common to whichever country you're looking at. Here, the slides that I've got up here are from Czech, Hungary, and Poland, going left to right. Very strong similarity. Not much consensus as to why this has happened. The best guess is that the Central Europeans, as you know, back in March, closed down very early and very rigorously. And some people say that what you're seeing now is pretty much what Spain and Italy and some of the more badly hit countries had to face earlier on. We'll see how things develop. Poland especially is a big worry. Even on the current statistics, which are dramatic enough, there is a suspicion that there's significant undercounting going on because of the fairly low level of testing that is being done. And so it's not clear when and where we're going to see the peaks. There has been a little bit of a clearer decline in the Czech Republic and elsewhere, and we've obviously seen the fairly rigorous restrictions that have been imposed both in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic especially, to try and dampen down that curve. So we'll see where it takes us. The recovery, however, I think will be robust. There are significant productivity, infrastructure, and supply chain reserves in the region. And as we were discussing earlier, there will be a competition between the EU, the US, and Asia to provide the resources. But there will be different conditions attached. The EU will be trying to be trying to keep on a focus on transparency, rule of law. The US, particularly focused, and the US industry obviously focused on a competitive environment, whereas Chinese investment, insofar as it ever comes, will be linked to some sort of foreign policy demands. But that's all for the future. But as we all know, the vaccine is coming. The vaccines are coming. Most of these countries have already signed up for either the Pfizer or the Moderna or the AstraZeneca vaccine. So just as in Western Europe, hopefully by the middle of next year, life will be returning to normal. And a lot of people are very optimistic about the prospects for economic pickup. Just finally, as we're drawing to a conclusion, back to what we were talking about, the strategic direction of the region, the real hope, and I think this is something that is not going to go away, is the 3 Cs initiative. As you know, the 3 Cs was set up a few years ago as a way of generating investment income into key energy infrastructure and digital projects which were intended to bring the region closer together. There are limitations on the way in which both monetary and fiscal policy can be used to revive the region. And one of the ways in which the long-term economic growth is going to be driven is through increased infrastructure investment. And this is really what the 3 Cs is about. As we've talked about earlier, substantial resources coming in from US investors, but also the creation of an indigenous 3 Cs investment fund driven by Poland, especially, but through other countries joining in, and already at a level which is going to allow for significant funding of the required infrastructure. There is a great gap here. There's a calculation that the size of the infrastructure gap is potentially over $1 trillion that needs to be spent over 10 years in those crucial areas. But together with the recovery plan from the EU, US money coming in from the private sector, and also this indigenous fund that's being created, there's a great hope that the infrastructure will be created, and that will be a further foundation for the future growth of the region. So it's pretty good news, despite the fact that we go through a very bumpy period domestically, internationally, with the US, with COVID. After all these things are put to bed, after we get a good relationship with the EU, a new relationship with the United States, and COVID finishes, I think the region will be very well placed to take up and look forward to future growth. So that's a very, very quick overview. As those of you who know me, I could go on for a long time on each of these bullets, but I've tried to keep it as brief as I can. And I very much hope that you found it useful, and looking forward now to the panel debate to take some of these issues hopefully a little bit further. Thank you very much, Richard, and good luck with the rest of the conference.